Welcome, Helaine. This event marks the acquisition of shadow figures into the collection here at the Sainsbury Centre. This extraordinary gift was made through the Contemporary Art Society by Eric and Jean Cass. Our visitors have responded already so positively to the work. I think its luminosity, its brilliance speaks for itself. And as you move through the gallery, it's just really wonderful to see it at different points in the day, to see how people are experiencing the work. Since the Centre's relaunch in 2023, we've been, I suppose, placing a renewed focus on this, the importance of this intensely personal relationship that we have with works, both within the collection, but those works coming to us on loan as well. And I suppose through this opening up possibilities, so sometimes through touch, sometimes through sound, a kind of multi-sensory experience. And for me, this feels like it has a very natural affinity, Helaine, with your work. But I understand this isn't the first time you've had work on display here at the Centre.
No, I had my first exhibition in England at the Sainsbury Centre.
Okay.
And that was in 1981, a long, long time ago. And there was only one building where what is now the cafe. And that was an incredible experience because it came about really through the Sainsburys and through the American Embassy, but it was also that the American ambassador knew Lisa and Robert. And their idea about how they saw the museum was very much my idea of how a museum should be, a kind of almost not museum. I'd been very interested in having work come out of the gallery, out of the museum, in a place where everybody could experience it. And
that's very much reflected in the archival photography we have of that 1981 show. And you weren't showing alone, were you? Can you tell us a bit more about your role in that?
Yes, the idea came basically in 1976 when there was the celebration or the sadness about the American independence. And the American Embassy planned an exhibition of work of Americans in British collections. And they did that there wasn't a Sainsbury Centre at that time. They did that in the embassy. And as I think it probably came about because then the ambassador, knowing the Sainsbury, the idea came up of doing a show of Americans working and having chosen England as a place to live. And 4 sculptors was chosen, and I was asked if I would be willing to help organize it, which I was.
And how was that experience of working so closely with those 3 other sculptors? I'm just thinking in terms of thinking about the building, thinking about the space. It offered so many possibilities, I'm sure. I'm really struck by the light, for example, from those photographs.
Well, the 4 sculptors were all working in different ways. There was only one building, and the rest of it was a complete building site. And that building was the one you mostly have probably experienced today because it was a cafe. So that was the first structure, and it was just full of light. And we decided, since we were each working in very different ways, one person, Dante Leonelli, who was extremely conceptual, hung work from the ceiling. And one woman sculptor, Helen Fazenmeyer, did all the walls. She was a sculptor, but she did constructions that were made from her ideas, and they were all kind of wall things. And Leonard Baskin, who was by far the senior sculptor in that group, who'd come to England because he and Ted Hughes were working together all the time, illustrating each other's work. And I chose to be on the floor with Leonard.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the works you showed for that particular exhibition? Is that something that you can recollect?
Yes, I mean, the works, some of them you'll see in the photos as you... I was already doing multiple pieces that had no top and no bottom and could be seen in many different configurations. And that was, and during the exhibition we changed the configurations, and people would come and say, "Oh, I love the sculpture that was there, what happened to it?" And didn't recognize, because the pieces were quite abstract, but always had a figurative undertone, I suppose. I had already conceived of Shadow Figures, which is a piece you have, but I didn't have a model of it at that time. But I was, yeah, I think Baskin's work is very figurative, very narrative in some way. And it was an interesting contrast going in a huge space. We occupied the entire space of that restaurant, which when I look at it now, I think it's amazing. But it did mean I could put in, the piece Figurative Landscape was the model for my first major commission, which was actually in America, for the American government architecture program. And it went to become a very important work in Milwaukee, the center of their urban revitalization. Okay. And so we had a huge model which took up this amount of room almost as the centerpiece. I had wanted to offer to the people there the chance of having it moved, but they didn't go for that. You might now.
Yeah, I was going to say perhaps that would be approached slightly differently now. And you made the very kind offer for myself to be able to move your sculpture as we walked through
yes,
today.
When you came.
Yes.
Yes. And today. I just moved today, yes.
Yeah, it's already been moved, which is great. So, Helaine, you had your first solo show in New York. Was that the late 60s, 68?
Yes, 68 it would have been, yes.
Okay. And then you came to the UK shortly afterwards, within the next 5 years, a show at Kettle's Yard in 73?
Yes, we came in 70. No, 69 we came in.
Okay. And in terms of your experiences in the 60s, can you tell me a little bit more about your training, about how the world of sculpture really opened up for you?
Oh my goodness, that's a very long question.
That's a very long question. You can pick it apart and reject it as you see fit.
No, but it will take a little while to tell about that. I'm glad if you're holding the mic, except I find it. Yes, I started by doing a degree in philosophy, partly at Oxford University. But I think if I'm going to talk about my journey, it would have to start when I was a child, because I think as a child, as many people I think must have discovered in their own lives, dreams were very important to me. But whenever I tried to express a dream, which was really quite a visionary dream, words completely failed. And I only later in life realized that words are not capable of describing dreams. Dreams need an extraordinary language, a language that isn't based on words, based on something specific. Because dreams take you from a world of fantasy and possibility and aspiration to the hope that these things could be. And words describe mostly what exists. So making that transition from fantasy to reality as a child, I just thought I didn't have the words. I didn't know that I didn't have them. I didn't know there were no words that could describe this. So I kept looking for them, reading and struggling. In the end, I think I did what most people do. They adjusted their brilliant dream to something banal that fitted into the language. And I think now I realize that this is a problem that we all face, that moving from our visions to reality is a very difficult journey. But I was determined to make it, and I went on with words, thinking that was where I needed to be, until I was with my husband in a museum in Naples and saw Cycladic figures. And what is so amazing to me, and I have to say it now, is to see that Calvin, who was then director here, put my sculpture in clear view of Cycladic sculptures. So you come in and you see them. The Cycladic sculpture, and why it shocked me, was that there's so few details. And yet you look at it and you see a whole world. I'd been doing portraits, and they didn't tell me really, they couldn't communicate what I wanted to. A Cycladic head with only maybe 2 features and a shape and an outline communicates a whole philosophy of life, a whole person's existence. And I suddenly, and in combination with the Cycladic work in the museum in Naples, there were the archaic figures of the Greek period. So some are 500 BC, the Cycladic are 2500 BC. These wonderful archaic terracottas even have so much detail, just the opposite, but so much pathos in the way they're sitting or figuring or heads are. And somehow the combination of these two things, these two visual inputs, filled me with this sense, I can do this. I can express my dreams by becoming a sculptor. And shortly after that, Yorick and I married and lived in Paris. And he said, what are you going to do? I'd been teaching philosophy at that point. He said, you can't even really speak French. What are you going to do? And I don't want to speak French. I want to become a sculptor. And there's no better place to do it. So we immediately, the first thing we did when we came to Paris was to get clay, and I started making small figures. And I just felt like people must feel who are suddenly able to play the piano and never having studied it. I just felt I could do this. I loved everything I made. And then York took pictures of them, and we went to Beaux-Arts, which was then the center of sculpture. And in those days, it didn't matter that you hadn't any CV with you or letters of recommendation. All you really needed was either the actual object or, in my case, the photographs. So I was accepted at Beaux-Arts, but we didn't have any money. So I couldn't pay the tuition in advance, nor could I start the next day, which I really wanted to do. And so the director there who'd accepted me, or two people, said, why don't you go to Le Grand Chaumière? Because there you can start the next week, and you pay week by week. So that's what we did. I went to Le Grand Chaumière, and I was accepted immediately. And they said, when would you like to start? I said, I'd like to start as soon as possible, Monday, he said, well, following Monday. I said, great. And he said, but on Monday, there's only one teacher, and this is someone called Pierre. I said, that's fine, I don't care about the teacher. But the teacher was very figurative, and he really didn't like my work. So at the end of the week, he said, well, it was nice to see you. I don't expect you'll come back. I said, why not? He said, well, obviously you don't have the talent for it. But I did go back. And some weeks later, great sculptor, Zadkine, came and looked at everybody's work, because you put it on a shelf near to your cavaletto where you're working. And he said, oh, I would love to see this bloke. Send him to my salon. This is really exciting work. And so I was invited on that next Sunday. I was very shy. I really still didn't speak French. I still don't speak it well. And York was going to be somewhere else. I had to go alone. And I went to what is still his studio in Rue de Sas, which is now a museum, and knocked on the door. No one ever answered, so I finally just went in a great room full of people, mostly men, except for his wife. And he looked at me, he said, and said in French, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" I almost left, but I did go in, and by the time the afternoon was over, he'd invited me to come and work in his studio. So that's a long story.
But it's an absolutely fascinating one, and I want to hear the next instalment. So you found yourself in the studio, and those experiences, I'm sure, have stayed with you. Can you talk about those early days in that space, sharing that space, and your ideas and the things that were coming to you kind of intuitively, I suppose? And was there any kind of teaching involved? What was the relationship?
There was no teaching. He actually didn't really want a student. He just wanted someone to come in every single day at 8 o'clock, leave at 5, and enforce his discipline. And now that I am at a certain age and not a young person, I understand that discipline, because so many things come in your way. You want to be in the studio, but if you don't have that necessity, perhaps you don't go in the studio. And at that time I thought, this is ridiculous. But yes, of course, if those are the terms, I will come in at 8, I will leave at 5, that's fine. But the teaching, it made you see what teaching is about. Teaching is who you are, how you work, what you do, what you believe in. You teach by example, you teach by reference, you teach about, in a way, by sharing your life experience. So the teaching would be when we'd have a sandwich, a panino at lunchtime. And actually, at the time, I would have said, oh, I really didn't learn from him. One of the first pieces I made that was a very abstract figure, but the neck of it broke. And I didn't think about it. The next time I made a similar piece, the same thing happened. So I asked him, why is this always happening? And he just looked at me, no. And I stopped making heads. It's very simple. But I suppose my view was that he wasn't a good teacher. I wasn't really learning things, but I was watching and I was experiencing. And the first thing that was so incredibly clear was this was his life. It was a way of life. It wasn't a profession. It wasn't a job. It was who you were. It was breathing. He was in his own world. When he was working, he had no idea what I was doing. If I left early, he had a very big idea and he'd be furious. So I might share a story with you. One day, the head of Newsweek, my husband was working for, K. Graham, was coming to Paris, and he said, you've just got to be there with me, and you'll have to leave early today. He knew how hard that would be, and you'll have to bring, you can't come back in the clothes you wear to work in. So that day I brought a little paper bag so it didn't look too auspicious of my dress clothes. And at about 3:30, I went to the bathroom, which we all shared, and I stayed in there a very long time. And I came out. He looked at me. What are you doing? I said, I have to meet my husband. and in fact, I have a car waiting for, he's got a car waiting for me outside. You're not leaving here like that. What will people think? You look like a whore. And I mean, to him, makeup and jewelry and high heels, he just was absolutely furious. But he was furious because the only thing he wanted of me wasn't talent really at that point, but just attention and following that same, this is all that matters. If you leave now, don't come back. And he was fierce, he was small, and he had a mane of white hair and a very red face, and he terrified me, especially in that moment. And this was pretty early on. But I did leave, and I did come back, and in a way, we had a new relationship after that. It was important for me to do that. But much more than that, I learned from him, and he was brilliant. I think as I do, he worked between passion and reason and emotion. And something really fascinating, because he was once described as a passionate realist. And I thought that was such an important thing, because he was never blinded by realism. He always carried his emotion into it. He had terrible experiences in the war, First World War, and I think that influenced his work. He certainly, just as I do, whether I got that from him, I don't think I did, because that's what I was doing. He was very much feeling the raw material of his sculpture was his own psyche, his own inner life. And he was always translating his dreams into clay, and he almost always did do a clay model. And the other thing that was very similar between us, and perhaps I learned it from him, he had certain themes that went through his entire life, and he was very involved with mythology and trying to get to the core of the mythology and changing it. And that's something that certainly stayed with me as well. And I think he probably did teach me, although I don't know that he did. He never said it, but by how he worked. And it's something that's very strong in my view, that the fear is never to copy someone else. The real fear in any creative artist is to copy yourself and keep copying yourself, finding something that you can do and people like, and just continuing with that. And he never did that. And again, he never taught me, but he stopped himself from copying himself by experimenting with different materials and different ways of working all the time, because you are limited. If you're working only in clay, your work looks it. I'm even working digitally, which I don't really mentally approve of, but I discovered that you can then adjust it, you can change it. And so I think in so many ways, looking back, and I wish I'd understood that so I could have told him, but I think I was so fortunate to come into contact with someone of that intelligence. And perhaps the other thing I learned, and some people say that wasn't the right thing, is it's never about success. It's never about being known. It's really about, in your own mind, achieving what you want to achieve. And he didn't, I think he did have success, but not. A friend of mine gave me, who had an enormous, her husband left her and left for me the sculpture books. And in all these books, there's so little written about Zadkine, and yet I beseech you all to look him up, because he is one of the great sculptors of the 20th century. So much better than many of the people whose names you will know, and I won't say them. But he was an amazing sculptor.
Thank you, Helaine. I realise my arm is slightly shaking. I might have to ask somebody to hold the mic for me. I think, you know, your observations about that experience of being with somebody who, almost that kind of that physical proximity, that observation, it's so important. But I wanted to pick up on this idea of working across different themes, different contexts, and that those themes emerge or stay with you and express themselves in different ways. And you've talked in other contexts about the importance of series and why those themes remain so strong, and they develop over time, of course. But can you speak a little bit more about how that emerged? I'm just thinking, for example, about your early sculptures.
Certainly, one of the themes that's gone through all of my work came about with the sculpture that consists. It's had different names. but it became two sides of a woman. And there is, I'm sure, a picture of it. So it looked like three figures. Two of the figures, which are probably clearly male and female, which at that point I still was doing, are connected with the female more or less looking dependent upon the male figure. They're very abstract. And then there's a separate figure on its own axis, which turns the head very proud. It turns in any direction. The male figure seems to be looking over his shoulder at the woman behind him, the single figure. And I did it, as I do most of my work, very intuitively. I don't have a drawing. I have no idea where I'm going. I don't look at it to begin with. I just work the clay, and then I suddenly feel I'm ready to look at it. In this one, when I looked at it, I was quite shocked, because I felt it was so descriptive of where I was at that moment. I was initially that very independent woman, very strong, on my own, turning, moving, living. And how had I become this very dependent female on this male figure? This was the first year or so that Yorick and I were living in Paris, in an early piece. And it was a warning to me. It was actually saying, you know, that's don't turn into that dependent woman. But when I told that to my husband, he said, no, I love both sides of you. It's okay to be dependent and to be romantic and to be in love. And it's wonderful that you still can be independent and strong. Don't feel there's any, if you've changed, it's for the better, not for the worse. You don't have to be one thing. And I began to realize that initially this whole theme of two sides of a woman was really about me, about my personal feelings. That theme has come through everything I've done, to see that we are all so many possibilities. We have not just two sides, we have multiple sides. And it's really important to try to uncover these and develop them. So what started really, my first themes were intimacy, creation, two sides of a woman. Then my next theme was metamorphosis, which is about transformation, and really was beginning to see that it's not just what I thought. It is the possibility of transforming ourselves. And that's gradually, over the years, come into the realization that it's not, my whole world, my whole universe, in terms of my perception, has become wider and wider, and I'm now looking at the whole situation of the world we're living in and how we can transform that. So my later themes, after metamorphosis, one of the most important ones is perhaps one called The Light Within. And it's the idea of looking within ourselves to see what illuminates us, what light we have, and through that light to illuminate others around us. So I'll give an example of how I don't really think about it, it just happens. So I was very, very affected by the enormous exodus that we see around us, and understanding the theme of exodus is really about hope. We leave one place to try to go to another place where we hope life will be better and we can transform it. Yeah. But I didn't realize as I was doing it that I talked to someone who'd been working in Lesbos with all the refugees coming in on their rafts and not surviving because they were being sold life jackets that were made out of straw, and when anything happened there was no way of surviving. And I was so moved by it that I went back to my studio and I suddenly found myself creating a sculpture that was so unlike anything I'd done. It wasn't vertical, it wasn't even horizontal, it was, and I didn't realize that it was so related. It was really, as someone who came in and said, it was like the Jacob painting in the Louvre of the raft of Medusa. And so these themes come through you because you're feeling it and dreaming about it and thinking about it. And at the moment, I think I'm really, all the themes seem to come into each other, so I think that's a good thing.
There's such a fragility, a vulnerability. I'm just thinking of the light within, actually, and some of the images are on the screen. But there's also, I suppose, something about that really, I suppose, allows you to, there's that transparency at the same time as strength, that all of those things are present. And there's an element of you know, pushing yourself in terms of technique as well, isn't there? I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the risk-taking involved in pushing yourself in that way, in working so intensely.
Yes, I think that that creativity depends on risk. And it's why I'll come to something like this and not want to have a speech, I want to be able to search myself to address a group. So that I think nothing new happens without taking a risk. But in a way, the way I work creates risks, because I never have an idea of where I'm going. I never know whether what I'm feeling is going to communicate itself to someone else. I never know whether that will be seen as I see it. I think art is a risk. Being an artist is a risk if you're willing to be on that edge. But I think also, Joseph Campbell, I may have given up philosophy as a profession, but I haven't given it up as a way of being. And was very moved. I don't know how many of you, if anyone's read anything of Joseph Campbell, but he has said that he thought that art was revelation. But it's only revelation if you come to it without any expectation. So I love this museum, because you really embody that whole philosophy, the idea that you can touch it, that you can really absorb it, that you can hear it in some cases. Because I think that is really where art goes beyond almost any other way of communication. It goes back to where I began with this idea of words. It's through art that your vision and your possibility of imagining is realized, and I think that's incredibly important. But so working, I always thought with clay because it follows my mind, it follows my hands. I don't even see. So at the beginning, I don't look at what I'm doing. I can't even work in the dark. And at a certain point, and that's all, it's all coming from intuition and emotion. But at a certain moment, you have to stand back and look at what you've done and judge it and begin to see how aesthetically it can be better. Because up until that moment, it's all about you. It's confessional, really. And Otto Rank, who I also admire very much, who was a great analyst but also a great writer about art, said that no work of art can exist until it becomes not a subject anymore, but an object, until it separates from the artist. Till when you put it on that table, you don't need to explain it, because it will communicate to the people who look at it. And without that movement, and that doesn't happen unless you can stand back and can judge it and can very often say, you know, that's not working. I've had a couple of commissions based on a clay before I had enlarged it, but when I enlarged it, I felt, you know what, this isn't working. It's not, it was good as a small piece, but, and now I know I don't ever get to that because I know that. I know whether something will survive being on a large scale or whether it's meant to be intimate. So as you move along, you learn a lot of this.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking also about, you know, there's the various decision-making processes and when they occur. And when we've spoken before, Helaine, you say a common question is actually people ask you, you know, when do you decide to work in bronze? When do you decide to work in marble? And actually, you know, is that something that is also subconscious, or is
No. It's very much when the work is actually finished. So, if the stage I think that the real problem is that you start and you're working in a very frenzied and very emotional way, but then you have to suddenly switch into a kind of objective reality and look at it not in the dream world, but in that real world you're sitting in and how it looks. And then you get it back. Any clay work has to be then cast in plaster, because you can only finish it in plaster really finely enough. It's only when it's done in plaster that you make that decision. And if at that point, and it's not emotional at all, it's very, very real, very, very based on reason. If something seems to me finished when I see it in plaster, I will do, and I don't want to change it. It doesn't need to grow. It's wonderful as it is. I will definitely do it in bronze, because only bronze will reproduce what that is. If I do it in marble, I'll lose a lot of the texture. I'll lose a lot of the sense of my own hands working on it. And if I feel it can have another life, it's not born yet, I will do it in marble, which is very arduous, very long process. I can do a clay model sometimes in a week and it'll be wonderful, even in a day sometimes. But if you're going to do it in marble, it can be months, it can be even years until you actually finish it. And certain pieces I have in my own collection, I only did one of that series in marble because it was so time-consuming. So I had to learn to finish that kind of work so that I could do them in bronze, or they just never happened. And at the moment I've done a lot of work in wood, because I discover that wood gives so much to a very, it gives another level to the cycladic sculptures, which are so reductive, and yet the material is completely aligned with the form. And if you get the grain moving, it seems to be alive.
I love that idea. I wanted to pick up on something that you referred to a little earlier about letting go of the work, about putting it out into a space of which you've got no kind of, I suppose, control to some degree as to how people are going to respond to it. And I'm particularly thinking about your commissions for, or your public work rather, for Ely and Salisbury cathedrals. And those spaces clearly offer something quite incredible, but I wondered whether there's anything kind of unexpected about how people encounter the work in such, I suppose in many ways loaded environments.
I think it was transformational for me to show first in Salisbury Cathedral and later in Ely, and wonderful Jacqueline Creswell, who was the curator for both of these, is here today, and I'd like to thank her, because when she called me and asked me would I be willing to do the show at Salisbury, I was overwhelmed that the idea of showing in a cathedral was something I'd never thought about. But I think those two exhibitions were, although I've had wonderful, wonderful exhibitions with my gallerist, Abby Hignell, who's here, I have to say never like those two exhibitions, because working, and that's really what Joseph Campbell was talking about with revelation, because people go to a gallery thinking whatever they think, but some of them are thinking maybe like to buy something. Other people are looking, but it's in a limited environment. People coming into a cathedral are open to revelation. They're open to being moved. And if they're not, they probably wouldn't be there. But if they're not already there, when they come into that atmosphere, whatever religion they are, and so many people from so many different countries come. So my view of art as being a way of reaching people without, above and outside of culture, any culture. So just observing people looking at my work, going from piece to piece and being so emotive and so moved and not afraid to, and giving themselves over to that frightening experience of not just looking at something, but embracing it and taking it into who they are and being affected. And people would come back 2 or 3 times just to see the work, and we saw people hugging work, and we saw people just really so moved. And I think that for some reason in our society we have lost that ability of wonderment, of excitement, of emotion, and being able to sort of let something influence us that to take us, and that's what for me sculpture is all about. It's about aspiration. It's about taking us to see a world of possibility, a world that's beyond the material that we're living in. And I think I see how much that affects people in that kind of, in a cathedral. The same was true at Ely. I did a show at Canary Wharf. The reason and it was the biggest show I've ever done, 40 or 50 pieces and 12 or 14 of them outside, massive. And my hope for that was that people could begin to even to be in that kind of urban setting and see it not as a cathedral, but be open to be. And I can't tell you whether that happened or not in terms of the situation changed so much because it was during lockdown. And so the people who saw the work outside lived nearby and they could walk. And in my entire career, I have never had so much response. People sought out my website, and I was getting letters all the time from people who saw work and would tell me this work, Metamorphosis, just drew me to it. I felt it was calling me. I go every day, I'm so depressed, but when I go there, I leave feeling elated. Your work has enabled me to get through this. And I was so I got the response I wanted, but only because the conditions were so different.
You've talked about in various interviews that I've read, and we haven't spoken about this together, but ideas of legacy, and that to me feels like a very powerful one to evoke that kind of emotion in others.
Well, I think that I want people to begin to be able to formulate ideas without words, to be able to feel things without putting names to them, but to allow who they are and what they experience to shake them, to move them, and to move them to a greater realization of the importance of other people, the importance of community, which I think we begin to lose. And for a very long time, I really didn't like to talk publicly. I still don't. To be successful, you need to be willing to be seen and to be heard. And you need to follow some conventions, which I have never believed in wanting to. I've never wanted to go with a very big gallery that just sort of has a whole roster of people that they represent, but they're just dollar signs if they're in America. I had the most wonderful gallerist in New York who was Henry Moore's dealer, and my first show with Henry Moore came with this dealer who was called Alex Rosenberg, and he's one of the great people. And at one point he closed the gallery. And he said he closed the gallery because you didn't have to be an art dealer, an art historian or understand about art anymore. You had to be a salesman, and you had to know how to use PR. And he said he just, at that point, just became instead an appraiser of art and when he was asked by a judge in a court case, Mr. Rosenberg, do you consider yourself a competent, successful art dealer? He said, well, how would you define that? And the judge said, you define it. And he said, a really successful art dealer is one who has enough money to look at a piece of art and decide whether it's good or not without thinking about, can I sell it? And I think the art world has been corrupted by dollar signs, by prices of works. And so a lot of the work we see today is really based on having been built up by public relations. I find this very unpleasant, but in order to leave a legacy, you have to become known and the work has to be of value, or it will disappear. So the question of legacy is a very difficult one.
Well, I'm very aware we're close to an hour, and I feel that there's a beautiful legacy here upstairs in Shadow Figures, and very grateful to you for speaking publicly with us.
I'd like to just give one example of how I feel people can, and because I've had a transforming experience last week. A friend of mine who's a saxophonist and a sculptor came for tea, and some of you have heard him play. And over the last few months, he has become, because as a sculptor it's not been a good period, he said, to sell, so he's relied on playing the saxophone, which has been great because he's improved so much. I was so overwhelmed by the level of improvement when he's playing all the time, which I think is true of anything. And he played something that he knows I like, but now he played it, it was so overwhelming. I just sat there and all I could hear was the sound, and it actually transported me in my imagination. It created a mood that was so strong. I was just overwhelmed by it, and all kinds of emotions came out that were very important for me to express. And when he stopped, I just felt I was somewhere else. And I said, what was that called? And when he told me, I realized that it had so transcended the words and the lyrics. It was so beyond it. It was no longer this narrow but very beautiful poem. It was a world. It had taken me somewhere totally outside of myself. It was revelation. And to me, that expressed what I'm trying to do with sculpture, and why I don't like to call it anything. Because if you really are open, which I was on that occasion, to an experience of something like that, it can take you over. It can really change where you are. And it did for me. It was an enormous experience, which, as many of you know, I lost my husband a year ago. And this was the first moment listening to that music that allowed me to really feel all the things I needed to feel. So I just, this is the legacy I want to leave. I want people to realize that looking at something has so many aspects. You don't need to have words, and it takes you where words never will take you. Thank you.
Powerful words indeed. I wanted to invite people to, if you have any anything you would like to ask Helaine, or whether you'd prefer to do that upstairs over drinks. Anybody? Anything they'd like to ask now? Question at the back. I'll bring the mic to you.
Helaine, do you have a preference on producing works for the exterior and for all of those that are able to pass it, rather than interior?
Oh yes, I prefer to do, I love doing public works. I think public sculpture is my commitment, and it has been. I think I've done more public sculptures in cities and towns, and we were going to talk about public art because I think that is the way forward of creating community art and bringing so many people in. In my first sculpture in Milwaukee, I did a sculpture of movable parts, which we first showed here, the model of, and one of their requirements there from me was that they should at least once a year have those granite pieces moved, which they have a model, and they have people moving that and choosing the thing, and every year they do it. And to me, because it used to be commemorative, public art, statues as such, now they give meaning, give a soul to soulless plazas. They create a space for community to come to, and if it works, it becomes something that the community is proud of and they consider their own. And the sculpture in Milwaukee, after about 10 years, the developer who developed the public plaza changed, and they got an appraisal for the sculpture. It was worth endless more. So they decided to sell it on eBay to another city in Texas, and for a huge amount of money. And then the city itself, when they heard about this, got so outraged that when someone came to try to move it, they formed endless circles around the sculpture, and they wouldn't allow it to be. And there was such a protest that the whole question of who owned the sculpture, could it be moved, and my sculpture led to a new law coming in on most contracts in America, that when a sculpture is commissioned for a specific site and is worked out, I mean, the whole community had come to choose and discuss the sculpture, that has to stay there. They cannot move it. So I had done that, and I think I've done it with, well, a Canary Wharf, that's another big story. I had a sculpture which was commissioned for Wood Wharf, but Wood Wharf wasn't ready when the sculpture was. So it was placed in another location in Jubilee Park. When they were going to move it to Wood Wharf, there was protest. It had become, everyone had lunch there, they had picnics there, and they couldn't move it, so they commissioned me to do another one for Wood Wharf. And they both are there.
I think Canary Wharf is a wonderful example. So I've seen so many people drawn to Jubilee Park.
Yeah.
Fortuna, I've seen so many people that have walked off the path to touch it.
Yeah, they all touch it, yeah.
Almost dancing around it, ring a roses.
And they climb up them, and
and
this man is a wonderful person for me because he lights sculptures, and doing the lighting is all over. He's done a lot of mine.
Please put more everywhere.
Noted. Thank you. We haven't talked about public sculpture, but now we have, so I feel that was a brilliant
that was a
question.
great
Thank
question.
you very much.
Thank you.
If you join me in your appreciation of Helaine, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
We'll go upstairs. Thank you.
Thank you for the